a sleepy American town where time moves as slowly as syrup on pancakes, a black SUV pulls up to a family diner. Adorned men of the Sinaloa Cartel step out, weapons hidden under expensive jackets. They've come to collect protection payments from their new territorial acquisition. Fatal mistake. Behind the grill stands not just another chef in a stained apron. He's a former Marine Scout sniper with 84 confirmed kills from the Afghan mountains. While they see easy prey, he's already evaluated every angle, every possible shot, and every escape route. When the first threat lands on the counter, something long buried awakens in his eyes. Today, the cartel will learn why some predators wear aprons instead of uniforms. The bell above the diner's door chimes. But before we jump back into the video, let us know where you're watching from. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe because I have something really special for you tomorrow. And now, back to the video. The bell above the diner's door chimes, a small, innocent sound that cuts through the ambient clatter of forks against plates. A hush falls over the restaurant. The elderly couple in the corner booth stops mid-bite. The single mother hurriedly gathers her children closer. The local sheriff's deputy's hand instinctively moves toward his holster. Before freezing, he's off duty, outnumbered, and recognizes the gold-plated watches and distinctive tattoos of men who've already killed 2 officers 1 county over. 4 men enter, expensive boots clicking against the worn linoleum floor. Their leader, face scarred from a machete fight in his youth, scans the room with predatory eyes. He smiles, revealing a gold-capped tooth that catches the fluorescent light. Behind the grill, James "Hawk" Hawkins flips a burger with the same practiced precision he once used to assemble his M40A5 sniper rifle in complete darkness. His face betrays nothing, but his mind calculates angles, distances, and possibilities at lightning speed. The kitchen knife beside him could pierce a man's aorta from 8 feet away. The scalding coffee pot could blind. The heavy cast-iron skillet could crush a skull. "Good afternoon, amigos," the cartel leader announces, his accented voice carrying an artificial warmth that doesn't reach his eyes. "We are here for lunch, and a little business discussion with the owner." The waitress, Sally, a single mother, who's worked here for 15 years, stands paralyzed, coffee pot trembling in her hand. Her eyes dart to Hawk, a silent plea that doesn't go unnoticed by the intruders. The leader's smile widens. "Ah, so the cook is in charge. Even better. We can speak. Man to man." The cartel soldiers spread out strategically, one blocking the exit, another moving toward the kitchen's back door, the third positioning himself where he can watch the entire dining area. They've done this before in dozens of small businesses across 3 counties. The routine is always the same. Intimidate, establish dominance, extract payment. Anyone who refuses learns a brutal lesson that serves as an example to others. What they don't see is Hawk's subtle nod to Old Bill in the corner booth, a Vietnam veteran who immediately understands the signal. They don't notice how Hawk's posture shifts imperceptibly, weight now balanced perfectly for explosive movement. They don't recognize that the seemingly random items on the counter, the pepper shaker, the ketchup bottle, the order pad, have been positioned with deliberate purpose, ready to become improvised weapons in hands, trained to kill with anything available. "I think you gentlemen might be in the wrong place," Hawk says quietly, his voice carrying the stillness of a predator before it strikes. It's the same tone he used to reassure panicking Marines pinned down under Taliban fire. Calm, measured, certain. The cartel leader laughs, a harsh sound that makes children whimper and adults flinch. He places a hand on the counter, revealing a diamond-encrusted ring and a glimpse of the pistol holstered at his waist. "No, my friend. We are exactly where we need to be. This town now belongs to new management, and we've come to discuss your contribution to our Community Improvement Fund." He slides a piece of paper across the counter, a demand for $5,000 weekly, an impossible sum for a small-town diner. Behind him, his men smirk, already imagining the fear they expect to see. Instead, something happens that confuses them, seems to look through rather than at them. What they're seeing, though they don't understand it yet, is the awakening of the sniper who once held his position for 72 hours without moving to eliminate a high-value Taliban target. For Hawk Hawkins, who traded war for whisking eggs after 4 tours of duty left scars visible and invisible, the line has just been crossed. And when a man who's calculated wind conditions to make impossible shots in sandstorms makes a decision, what follows is as inevitable as gravity. The Last Shot Diner sat at the crossroads of County Road 17 and what locals still called Main Street. though its official name had been changed to honor a long-forgotten mayor decades ago. The building itself was an A. The cook's eyes change. It's subtle, a slight narrowing, a focus that seems to look through rather than at them. What they're seeing, though they don't understand it yet, is the awakening of the sniper who once held his position for 72 hours, without moving to eliminate a high-value Taliban target. For Hawkins, who traded war for whisking eggs after 4 tours of duty, left scars visible and invisible. The line has just been crossed. And when a man who's calculated wind conditions to make impossible shots in sandstorms makes a decision, what follows is as inevitable as gravity. The Last Shot Diner sat at the crossroads of County Road 17 and what locals still called Main Street, though its official name had been changed to honor a long-forgotten mayor decades ago. The building itself was an architectural timeline. Original 1950s bones, a 1970s renovation that added wood paneling, and early 2000s updates when the previous owner installed energy-efficient windows. A neon sign flickered intermittently, sometimes dropping the L so it read, Last Shot Diner, a joke that never failed to amuse the regulars. Inside, James Hawkins moved with quiet efficiency in the narrow kitchen space. At 5:15 a.m., 3 hours before opening, the diner belonged solely to him. Dawn was still a promise on the horizon as he prepped for the day ahead, cutting vegetables with military precision, portioning meat with calculated economy, arranging his station with the unconscious discipline of someone whose life once depended on knowing exactly where each tool was located. In complete darkness, his movements were fluid, methodical, nothing wasted. The kitchen knives were kept razor-sharp. The only way to properly respect a blade, he believed. The griddle was seasoned to perfection, the ancient cast iron carrying decades off flavors. The coffee was strong enough to put hair on your chest, as his father used to say. Everything in its place. Every process refined to its essence. At 42, Hawk's face carried the weathered lines of a man who had seen too much sun and too many things he couldn't unsee. His dark hair was kept high and tight, despite 5 years as a civilian. The scar that ran from just below his right eye to the corner of his mouth puckered slightly as he tasted the day's soup, adjusting the seasoning with a critical palate. Some days, his right knee predicted rain better than the weather service. The shrapnel they couldn't safely remove was his personal barometer. The diner had been a last resort investment, purchased with his military savings and disability pay when nightmares and hypervigilance made conventional employment impossible. He'd never expected to find peace flipping burgers and making small talk with locals, but somehow the simplicity had become his salvation. Every regular order, every holiday special, every birthday celebration was another step away from Helmand, province and the broken bodies of friends he couldn't save. "Morning, boss," Sally Jenkins called as she pushed through the back door at 6:30 a.m. sharp, her voice carrying the slight raspiness of a former smoker. At 57, she'd been working at the diner since before Hawk bought it. She knew every regular by name, remembered their orders, their stories, their losses and celebrations. She was the diner's heart, while Hawk was its steady hand. "Coffee's ready," Hawk responded with a nod, his standard greeting. Words still didn't come easily in the morning hours, sometimes not at all. Sally knew not to take it personally. She hung her purse in the small office, donned her apron, and got to work, setting up the dining room with practiced efficiency. She'd figured out Hawk's story in pieces over the years, not from what he said, but from what he didn't say, from the way he positioned himself with his back to walls, from how he startled at the sound of a car backfiring, from the way his eyes constantly scanned and assessed, from the nightmares that sometimes left him sleeping in his truck behind the diner rather than risking another episode in his apartment above the local hardware store. The morning routine unfolded with comfortable predictability. Bill Tennant, retired history teacher and Vietnam veteran, would arrive at 7:15 a.m. for coffee and the daily crossword. The Henderson twins, both in their 80s, would shuffle in at 7:45 for their shared breakfast of one order, split between 2 plates. Saving room for lunch, they always explained. Sheriff Denton usually stopped by around 8:30, uniform crisp, questions casual but eyes always watchful. Hawk respected the man's dedication to a town that rarely needed much law enforcement. "Anything unusual on your drive in?" Hawk asked Sally, as he sliced potatoes for the hash browns with machine-like consistency. "Nothing much," she replied, filling salt shakers, though there was a fancy black SUV parked outside the old Miller place, out-of-state plates. Never seen it before. Hawk's knife paused momentarily, the rhythm broken for just a fraction of a second before resuming. Texas plates. How'd you know? Sally looked up, surprised. Hawk shrugged, but his mind was already processing the information, filing it alongside other seemingly insignificant details he'd been collecting. The new faces at the gas station, the increased traffic on back roads, the nervous glances from Miguel at the grocery store when asked about his family back in Sonora. Just a guess, he said. But it wasn't. It was pattern recognition. The same skill that had once helped him identify which Afghan compounds might house snipers based on subtle differences in construction, or which mountain passes the Taliban preferred for ambushes. The bell above the door chimed at exactly 8:00 a.m. as Bill Tennant arrived 15 minutes early, disrupting Hawk's thoughts. "Morning, Sally." Hawk. Bill nodded, taking his usual seat at the counter. At 75, his movements were slower, but his mind remained sharp. His eyes, like Hawk's, carried the particular distance of men who had seen combat. It created an unspoken understanding between them, a shorthand that required no elaboration. "Coffee's fresh," Hawk said, sliding a mug across the counter before Bill could ask. "Appreciate it." Bill opened his newspaper. "Anything good happening in the world today?" "Depends on your definition of good," Hawk replied with the hint of a smile. Their usual exchange. As the morning progressed, the diner filled with the comfortable buzz of a small-town breakfast rush. Farmers coming in from early chores. Office workers grabbing coffee before the commute to larger towns nearby. High school students huddled over shared plates of pancakes, stretching their limited allowances. The last shot was a gathering place, a neutral ground where the community's various factions, political, religious, social, could coexist over eggs and bacon. At 10:17 a.m., two strangers entered the diner. They were well dressed in a way that stood out in Pine Creek. Expensive jeans, designer shirts, gold watches that cost more than most locals made in months. They sat at a booth by the window, ordered coffee but barely touched their food, and watched the comings and goings with poorly concealed interest. Their attempt to blend in only made them more conspicuous. Hawk noted their arrival without appearing to look up from the grill. He registered the bulges under their jackets, shoulder, holsters worn by men uncomfortable with their weapons, amateur enforcers with professional equipment. He listened to their Spanish when they thought no one was paying attention. Not the Mexican Spanish of the migrant workers who helped during harvest, but the distinctive Colombian-influenced Spanish of northern Mexico, Sinaloa specifically. Sally approached his station, keeping her voice low. "Those two give me the creeps. Keep watching the door like they're expecting someone. Probably just passing through," Hawk said. But he'd already identified 7 improvised weapons within reach and calculated the exact number of steps to his shotgun hidden beneath the counter. Old habits. When the strangers left, they tipped, exactly 15%, not a penny more, calculated to the dollar. They'd been gathering information, Hawk knew, learning the rhythm of the town, identifying key locations and people. He'd conducted similar reconnaissance himself in villages and cities where Americans were unwelcome, before calling in theirs of his team. The rest of the day passed without incident, but Hawk's internal alarm system, the finely tuned senses that had kept them alive through 4 combat tours, remained activated. As he closed up that evening, he performed an additional sweep of the building's perimeter, checking locks and sightlines with unconscious thoroughness. Pine Creek had been his sanctuary for 5 years. The locals had respected his privacy, accepted his quirks, and gradually welcomed him, despite his initial remoteness. They brought him casseroles when his nightmares were bad enough that word got around. They pretended not to notice when he dove for cover during the 4th of July fireworks. They directed their troubled veterans to his counter when the VA's waiting lists grew too long, and didn't comment when those same veterans left with steadier hands and calmer eyes after conversations no one else was privy to. In return, Hawk had, slowly, cautiously, allowed himself to belong. He sponsored 2 Little League teams. He taught a summer cooking class at the community center. He kept an unofficial tab for families when harvests were bad or medical bills piled up. He'd found a fragile peace in this place, a purpose that didn't involve a scope and a target. As he climbed the stairs to his apartment that night, Hawk's phone vibrated with a text from Marco, his former spotter, and the only person from his military life he remained in regular contact with. Confirmed sightings in 3 counties. The message read, "Hernandez Cartel moving north. Be careful, brother." Hawk stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the call button. Marco was now DEA, his military skills repurposed for the endless drug war. He'd been tracking cartel movements for years, watching as their territories expanded beyond border states into America's heartland. If Marco was concerned enough to break protocol and warn him directly, The situation was worse than he'd feared. Instead of calling, Hawk sent a brief acknowledgement and turned to the locked cabinet in his bedroom. The key hung around his neck alongside his dog tags, never removed, never lost. Inside was a reminder of the man he'd once been: cleaning supplies, specialized tools, component parts. Not a full weapon, he wasn't that paranoid yet, but enough to assemble one quickly if needed. His fingers moved over the items, muscle memory intact despite the years. He closed the cabinet without removing anything. Tomorrow was soon enough to decide what precautions might be necessary. Tonight, he would try to sleep, to maintain the normalcy he'd worked so hard to establish. But as he lay in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, Hawk's mind calculated and planned. The cartel's pattern was always the same: send scouts, identify vulnerable businesses, apply pressure through protection schemes, eliminate resistance, establish distribution networks. Pine Creek, with its location at the intersection of 3 county lines and its proximity to interstate highways, was an ideal logistics hub. The town's underfunded police force, Sheriff Denton and 2 deputies, would be easily overwhelmed. Hawk knew exactly what was coming. He'd seen it before in Afghanistan, where the Taliban used similar tactics to control villages. First come the threats, then the examples, then the occupation. Different players, same strategy. Territory, control, profit. The only question was how far he was willing to go to prevent it. The red numbers on his alarm clock flipped to 3:17 a.m. when he made his decision. Pine Creek had given him a home when he thought he'd never have one again. These people, Sally, with her endless compassion, Bill, with his quiet understanding, even Sheriff Denton, with his transparent attempts to check on Hawk's well-being disguised as casual visits, had become something like family. He would not abandon them to predators, even if it meant becoming one again himself. The black SUV appeared exactly 1 week later. It was Tuesday, typically the slowest day at the Last Shot diner. Rain pelted the windows, driving away the usual lunch crowd and leaving only the most dedicated regulars huddled over coffee cups and soup bowls. Sally had just refilled Bill Tennant's mug when the vehicle pulled into the parking lot, its high beams momentarily flooding the interior with harsh light before cutting off. Hawk noticed Sheriff Denton's hand drift toward his holster, though the off-duty officer tried to mask the movement by adjusting his belt. Their eyes met briefly, a silent acknowledgement of shared concern. "Sally," Hawk said quietly, "why don't you take your break now?" She glanced toward the window, saw the SUV, and understood immediately. "The dishes can wait," Hawk finished. His tone left no room for argument. The bell above the door jangled as 4 men entered, bringing with them the scent of expensive cologne and rain-damp leather. Water beaded on their immaculate shoes, each worth more than Hawk's monthly rent. Their leader, the scarred man Hawk had been expecting, removed designer sunglasses despite the dim interior lighting, a deliberate gesture to ensure his face was visible. A power move. A statement. "Welcome to the Last Shot," Hawk said evenly, wiping his hands on his apron. "Counter or booth?" The leader smiled, revealing that distinctive gold tooth. "Booth, I think. More comfortable for a business discussion." The 4 men slid into the largest corner booth, positioning themselves with clear sightlines to all entrances. The leader's facing Hawk directly, his back to the wall. 2 enforcers flanked him, while the 4th, younger, hungrier looking, remained standing, casually leaning against a support beam that happened to block the path to the kitchen door. Not amateurs, Hawk noted. They understood tactical positioning. Bill Tennant folded his newspaper deliberately, the crinkling paper unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. He placed exact change on the counter, nodded to Hawk, and walked out without rushing. The remaining customers, the Henderson twins, a truck driver passing through, and a young mother with a sleeping toddler, sensed the tension and began gathering their belongings. "Please," the leader called out, in a voice that sounded reasonable but carried unmistakable menace. "No one needs to leave. Finish your meals. We are only here to speak with the owner about a business opportunity." The mother hurried out anyway, clutching her child protectively. The Henderson twins followed slowly, their aged bodies unable to move quickly. The truck driver hesitated, looking at Hawk with a question in his eyes. Hawk gave a slight nod. "Go. The fewer civilians in the potential line of fire, the better." Only Sheriff Denton remained, seemingly absorbed in his coffee, but watching everything through the mirror behind the counter. "What can I get you, gentlemen?" Hawk asked, approaching the booth with menus but stopping just beyond arm's reach. "Close enough for courtesy, far enough for reaction time." "Your special hospitality," said the leader, his English perfect but marked by the distinctive cadence of northern Mexico. "My name is Diego Hernandez. These are my associates." He gestured vaguely to the men around him without introducing them. "We represent certain business interests that are expanding into this region." "Hawkins," he replied, with a nod. "But I expect you already knew that." Diego's eyebrows rose slightly, surprised at being called out so directly. "Your reputation precedes you, Mr. Hawkins. The locals speak highly of your mug establishment. It's just a diner, perhaps now, but with our help, it could be much more." Diego smiled again, all teeth and no warmth. "This location, at the crossroads, with good visibility from the highway, it has potential that is being wasted on," he gestured dismissively, "pancakes and coffee." Hawk said nothing, waiting. Let them reveal their hand first. Standard interrogation technique. Diego's smile faltered slightly at Hawk's silence. He extracted an envelope from his jacket and placed it on the table. "A gesture of goodwill," he explained. $5,000. Consider it an advance on our partnership." "What partnership would that be?" Hawk asked, not touching the envelope. Diego leaned forward, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "This town is changing, Mr. Hawkins. New opportunities are arriving. Smart businessmen recognize when to adapt. I'm just a cook." "No." Diego's eyes hardened. "You are much more than that, James Hawkins. Marine Scout Sniper. 84 confirmed kills in Afghanistan. Distinguished service record. Honorable discharge after—" He pretended to search his memory, though Hawk knew the information was carefully prepared. "An incident in Helmand Province that remains partially classified." Sheriff Denton's spoon clattered against his coffee cup. His first outward reaction to the conversation he was pretending not to hear. Hawk's expression remained neutral, but internally, his mind shifted. They'd researched him. This wasn't random. They'd specifically targeted his business knowing his background. The question was, why approach a former military sniper directly? Why not choose an easier mark? "Your military experience," Diego continued, "makes you uniquely qualified for our proposition. We need local partners who understand discipline, discretion, and the chain of command. I'm retired. No one with your skills ever truly retires, Mr. Hawkins. They simply find new applications for their talents." The younger enforcer, still standing, shifted his weight impatiently. His jacket parted slightly, revealing the butt of a handgun in a shoulder holster, not concealing it anymore. Another calculated move. "I appreciate the offer," Hawk said, his voice measured. "But I'm not interested in any new business ventures. The diner keeps me busy enough." Diego's friendly facade evaporated. "Perhaps I have not made myself clear. This is not merely an offer. It is the new reality. Our organization requires certain facilities in this region. Your diner provides ideal cover for our needs." "Drug distribution," Hawk stated flatly. Diego's eyes widened fractionally, surprised at the bluntness before he regained his composure. "Among other enterprises, you would be well compensated, protected, and if I decline." The threat came not from Diego, but from the younger enforcer, who took a half step forward. "Then maybe there's a kitchen accident. Grease fires are so dangerous. Or perhaps health inspectors find something concerning. Businesses close for many reasons." Sheriff Denton stood up slowly, his movement drawing all eyes. "Gentlemen, I couldn't help overhearing. Sounds dangerously close to extortion and racketeering, both federal offenses." Diego looked amused rather than concerned. "Ah, local law enforcement, so dedicated. Tell me, Sheriff. Denton, is it? Your badge says Denton. How is your daughter enjoying Northwestern University? Pre-law, correct? Such an expensive school, so far from home. It would be tragic if she encountered difficulties in Chicago." The color drained from Denton's face. "And your wife's medical treatments," Diego continued, examining his manicured nails. "Multiple sclerosis is a terrible disease. I understand the newest medications are helping considerably. It would be unfortunate if her insurance coverage experienced complications." Sheriff Denton's hand twitched toward his weapon, but froze as the youngest enforcer casually opened his jacket wider, fully revealing his pistol. The other two men at the table hadn't moved, but their alertness had visibly increased. 4 armed cartel members versus 1 sheriff and a cook. The math wasn't favorable. "That's enough," Hawk said, his voice quiet but carrying a hardness that made everyone in the room look at him. "You've made your point. I'll consider your offer." Diego studied him for a long moment, then nodded, apparently satisfied. "Wise decision. You have until Friday to accept your generous proposal." He stood, straightening his immaculate jacket. After that, our terms become significantly less favorable. The envelope remained on the table as the four men moved toward the exit, their choreographed movements revealing their awareness of tactical spacing. The youngest enforcer, clearly hungry to prove himself, deliberately bumped into Hawk's shoulder as he passed. 84 kills, he muttered in Spanish with a smirk. I've already got 30, old man, and I didn't need a fancy rifle to do it. Hawk didn't respond, didn't react. He'd been threatened by professionals. This posturing meant nothing. The bell chimed as they exited, returning to their SUV. Only when the vehicle pulled away did Sheriff Denton collapse back onto his stool, hands shaking. They know about my family, he whispered. They've been watching all of us. Hawk moved to the window, watching the SUV's taillights disappear into the rain. His mind was already cataloguing resources, mapping contingencies, assessing vulnerabilities. The same mental process he'd used before every mission. They're not just passing through, he said quietly. They're setting up a distribution network. Pine Creek is the perfect hub. Rural, understaffed law enforcement, access to 3 county lines and the interstate. What are you going to do? Denton asked, looking older than his 50 years. Hawk turned from the window, his decision already made. The peaceful civilian life he'd built was just an intermission. Deep down, he'd always known it might be temporary. I'm going to decline their offer, he said simply. They'll kill you. Then they'll take over anyway. Hawk picked up the envelope of cash, feeling its weight, the exact amount of his monthly operating costs. They'd done their homework thoroughly. No, he said with quiet certainty. They won't. The line had been drawn, the threat established. The mission parameters were clear. For the first time in 5 years, Hawk felt the familiar cold clarity of combat focus settling over him. The chef was receding. The sniper was awakening. Sally emerged from the back room, her face pale. I heard everything. What do we do? Hawk handed her the envelope. Deposit this, then call everyone who's missed a payment on their tab. Tell them it's forgiven. But we might not be open much longer. He untied his apron and hung it carefully on its hook. I need to make some calls. You sure about this, Hawk? Marco's voice crackled through the burner phone's speaker. Hernandez isn't some small-time operator. His organization has reach, federal, protection in some jurisdictions. Hawk stood at his apartment window, watching the street below through a gap in the blinds. The rain had stopped, leaving the asphalt slick and reflective under the streetlights. No suspicious vehicles, no watchers. Yet, I'm sure, he replied. They've marked my place, sheriff's family, probably others. This isn't a negotiation situation. Marco's, Cy carried through the connection. I can't officially help you. DEA has operations targeting Hernandez that I can't compromise. Unofficially, I'm still 3 states away. I'm not asking for help, just information. The silence on the line spoke volumes. Marco had been his spotter in Afghanistan. The second set of eyes that kept him alive through impossible shots and dangerous extractions. They developed the kind of trust that only comes from having your life in someone else's hands repeatedly. Marco knew exactly what Hawk was planning. Check your email in an hour, Marco finally said. Sending what I can, satellite images, known associates, properties registered to shell companies linked to their operation. Don't tell me what you do with it. Understood. And Hawk? Marco's voice softened. Remember the rules of engagement. Civilians. Collateral. Always, Hawk responded, the familiar pre-mission exchange settling his nerves. In combat, they'd had a code. Certain lines they wouldn't cross, no matter the mission parameters. It had kept them human in inhuman situations. After ending the call, Hawk moved to the locked cabinet. This time, he removed its contents methodically. Weapon components, specialized ammunition, camouflage materials. He arranged everything on his kitchen table, the routine so deeply ingrained that his hands moved automatically. An hour later, his laptop pinged with an encrypted message. Marco had come through. 12 properties within a 30-mile radius, all purchased within the last 8 months through different corporate entities, but tracing back to the same holding company in Mexico. Personnel files on Hernandez's known lieutenants. Surveillance, photos from border operations. Hawk studied Diego Hernandez's file with professional detachment. 47 years old. Former Mexican military special forces. Trained by American contractors. Defected to the Sinaloa Cartel in 2011. Responsible for at least 22 confirmed killings personally. Hundreds more by proxy. Known for psychological warfare and targeted intimidation rather than random violence. A strategist, a patient predator. The enforcer who'd threatened him, Mateo Vega, 28, Diego's nephew. Ambitious, volatile, rising quickly through the ranks due to family connection and a willingness to perform the most brutal tasks without question. Preferred method, close-range execution, often preceded by torture. By dawn, Hawk had committed every detail to memory and developed his initial strategy. He wouldn't have the support team, equipment, or intelligence resources he'd had in the military, but he had something equally valuable: local knowledge and invisibility. No one looked twice at a diner owner driving around his own town. When the dessert diner opened at 8 a.m., Hawk was behind the grill as usual. Sally gave him a questioning look, but he shook his head slightly. Not here. Not now. The morning routine unfolded with manufactured normalcy, though regular customers sensed something had changed. The diner was unusually quiet, conversations muted, glances exchanged. At 10:30 a.m., Hawk hung up his apron. Taking inventory, he told Sally. Back in a few hours. His battered pickup truck attracted no attention as he drove the county roads, his route appearing random but methodically covering the access points to each of the properties from Marco's list. He drove past abandoned warehouses, recently purchased, farms, a defunct gas station under renovation. At each location, he noted security measures, personnel movements, vehicle types. He took mental photographs, assessing sightlines, cover, approaches. The largest property, an old hunting lodge 10 miles outside town, showed the most activity. New fencing, armored guards poorly disguised as groundskeepers, regular deliveries. Hawk parked at a distance on public land, using high-powered binoculars that had once served him in Afghanistan to study the compound. Diego's SUV was parked outside the main building. Headquarters located. Phase 1, complete. The cartel made their next move faster than Hawk anticipated. He returned to the diner at 2:17 p.m. to find Sally shaking, her mascara smeared from crying. Sheriff Denton was there too, his official vehicle parked prominently outside. A futile show of authority. "They took Miguel," Sally blurted as soon as Hawk entered. "From the grocery store. His wife came here looking for help." Miguel Suarez, Pine Creek's only grocery store owner. Mexican-American, third generation. His refusal to allow drug distribution through his store must have made him an example target. "When?" Hawk asked, already calculating. "About an hour ago," Sheriff Denton said, his voice tight with suppressed rage and helplessness. Two men walked in, showed him something that made him go pale. He told his cashier he had to step out for a minute. Security camera shows him getting into a black sedan voluntarily. Voluntarily. Because they'd threatened his family. Standard cartel tactic. "I called county," Denton continued. "State police. They're looking into it, but without evidence of foul play." He trailed off, the frustration evident. Hawk nodded. Law enforcement was already compromised, intimidated, or both. Official channels would be deliberately slow. By the time they acted, Miguel would be a message left for the town to find. "I need to make a delivery," Hawk said, meeting Sheriff Denton's eyes with a look that conveyed more than words. Denton hesitated, then nodded almost imperceptibly. Plausible deniability. Don't ask, don't tell. 30 minutes later, Hawk was driving toward the hunting lodge compound, a covered tray of food on his passenger seat. A legitimate reason for a diner owner to be making a delivery, should anyone. "Stop him!" Beneath the food trays, a Glock 19 with suppressor, a combat knife, and tactical restraints. He wouldn't go in shooting. Not yet. This was information gathering, with the possibility of extraction. Find Miguel, assess security, retreat, and plan if extraction wasn't immediately feasible. The guard at the gate was young, bored, and unprofessional, more concerned with his cell phone than security. He barely glanced at Hawk or his vehicle. "Food delivery for Mr. Hernandez," Hawk said, his posture deliberately slouched, his expression neutral. The guard waved him through without checking ID or calling ahead. The first serious security lapse Hawk noted. Inside the compound, he counted 8 visible personnel, identified probable weapon locations, and memorized the layout. His truck was directed to a service entrance where another guard, equally complacent, pointed toward the kitchen door. Inside, the hunting lodge had been transformed. Expensive furniture, high-tech security monitors, the jarring contrast of tactical equipment alongside luxury items. Hawk moved with the unassuming demeanor of service staff, invisible towmen who considered themselves important. He set the food in the kitchen where 2 Mexican women were cooking. They avoided eye contact, either staff or captives, but clearly terrified. Hawk didn't push. Instead, he asked casually about using the restroom. establishing aeration to move through the building. The bathroom window provided a view of an outbuilding where two armed men stood guard, probable detention site. As he washed his hands, the door opened, revealing Mateo Vega, Diego's hot-headed nephew. Recognition flashed in Mateo's eyes, followed quickly by suspicious anger. "You're not delivery staff." Hawk maintained his calm facade. "Just dropping off an order from town. Your man at the gate sent me through." Mateo's hand moved toward his weapon, but in the confined space of the bathroom, Hawk had the advantage. Heiselbow connected with Mateo's throat, precise, controlled force. Not enough to crush the windpipe, but sufficient to disable temporarily. As Mateo gasped for air, Hawk executed a swift takedown, pinning him against the tile floor. "Miguel, Suarez," Hawk whispered, applying calculated pressure to Mateo's carotid artery. "Where?" Mateo struggled, but the pressure increased, cutting blood flow to his brain. The fear in his eyes confirmed what Hawk suspected. This enforcer was used, to having the power advantage, unprepared for being on the receiving end. "Outbuilding," Mateo choked out, as the edges of his vision darkened. "Demonstration. Tomorrow." Hawk maintained the hold until Mateo lost consciousness, then zip-tied the enforcer's hands and feet, gagged him, and locked him in the bathroom. Stall. He had minutes at most before someone noticed Mateo's absence. Too tight a window for extraction. Miguel was alive, but scheduled for a demonstration. Cartel terminology for a public execution meant to intimidate the community. Hawk memorized guard positions, verified the outbuilding's layout through a window, and returned to his truck. He drove away exactly 12 minutes after arrival, his unassuming vehicle attracting no special attention. Only when he reached town did he pull over and release the tight control he'd maintained, his hands finally shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline. Phase 2 complete, intelligence gathered, but time was critically short. "I'm going with you," Sheriff Denton insisted, checking his service weapon in the back room of the diner. "No." Hawk's tone left no room for argument as he assembled components with practiced efficiency. Night had fallen, providing the cover of darkness for the rescue operation. "You maintain plausible deniability. Stay here. Be seen publicly. Establish your alibi. He's my constituent. My responsibility. Your family is your responsibility," Hawk countered. "Your daughter at Northwestern. Your wife. They've already threatened them once. Don't give Hernandez a reason to follow through." Sheriff Denton's shoulders slumped. "This isn't right. This isn't how it's supposed to work." "No," Hawk agreed. "But it's how it is working." Tonight, Bill Tennant entered the back room, his Vietnam-era field jacket, a stark reminder of another war fought partly in shadows. "My truck's ready. Disabled the interior lights. Back roads mapped. No electronics that can be tracked." Hawk nodded gratefully. Bill had volunteered without being asked, one veteran to another, understanding the mission without requiring explanation. "If I'm not back by dawn," Hawk told Sally, who was stress-baking pies to maintain her composure, "open as usual. Act normal. And, if you don't come back at all?" she asked, fear evident in her voice. Hawk didn't answer. Some possibilities weren't worth voicing. The night extraction plan was simple by necessity. Bill would drive Hawk to a drop point 2 miles from the compound. Hawk would approach on foot, using the terrain to avoid perimeter security. Enter using the bathroom window he'd already identified as a vulnerability. Extract Miguel from the outbuilding during the midnight guard change that he'd observed during reconnaissance. Escape through the dense woods behind the property. Simple, direct, minimal moving parts to malfunction. But as every combat veteran knows, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Hawk was halfway to the outbuilding, moving silently through shadows, when floodlights suddenly illuminated the entire compound. Sirens wailed. Guards scrambled into defensive positions. Dogs barked frantically. Someone had discovered Mateo. Security protocols activated. Hawk froze in place, using a maintenance shed for cover. Retreat was the logical choice. The mission parameters had changed fundamentally. But from his position, he could see guards dragging Miguel from the outbuilding toward a waiting vehicle, moving the asset. If Miguel left the compound, the probability of rescue dropped to near zero. Decision point: abort or adapt. Hawk adapted. He changed angles, using the chaos of the security response as cover to move closer to Miguel's position. Guards were focused outward, expecting an external threat. Hawk moved inward instead, utilizing blind spots in their security formation. He was 20 yards from Miguel when the first guard spotted him. Hawk dropped the man with a precisely aimed shot from his suppressed Glock before an alarm could be raised. 15 yards. Another guard turned, another silent shot. 10 yards from Miguel, close enough to make eye contact, to see hope flash across the grocery store owner's terrified face. Then the compound's main door opened, and Diego Hernandez emerged, flanked by 4 guards. Between them, they half-carried, half-dragged Mateo, still groggy from the earlier confrontation. "I know you're here, Mr. Hawkins," Diego called out, his voice carrying across the compound. "Your restraint technique is quite distinctive. Military precision." Hawk remained motionless in the shadows. 3 guards between him and Miguel. 4 more with Diego. Unfavorable odds. "Perhaps you need motivation to show yourself," Diego continued. With a casual gesture to his men, he issued an order in Spanish. One of the guards raised his weapon to Miguel's head. "No!" Hawk called out, standing slowly, his weapon carefully aimed at Diego despite the distance. "Let him go. This is between us." Diego smiled that gold-toothed smile. "Indeed it is. But now we understand each other better. You are not merely a retired Marine playing at civilian life. You are still a hunter. And you're still prey." Hawk responded, his finger steady on the trigger. "Perhaps." Diego nodded thoughtfully. "But you face a tactical dilemma, sniper. You cannot shoot all of us before we kill your friend. You cannot escape without abandoning him. A stalemate, professionally speaking." Hawk calculated angles, distances, probabilities. Diego was right. Even with his skills, the math didn't work. Someone would die, most likely Miguel. "Release him," Hawk said. "Take me instead." Diego laughed. How noble, how American, but unnecessary. He gestured again, and his men lowered their weapons. "Mr. Suarez is going home tonight, unharmed." Confusion flickered across Hawk's face. This was not about him, Diego explained. "It was about you, about confirming my suspicions regarding your capabilities, about seeing how you would respond to a threat against your community." Understanding dawned. This hadn't been an execution setup. It had been a test, a performance evaluation. "Your skills are impressive," Diego continued, "breaking in, subduing my nephew without permanent damage, moving through security undetected until the alarm. These are abilities my organization values highly. I already declined your job offer. That offer was for a passive role, a front for our operations." Diego spread his hands. "This is different. This is an offer worthy of your particular talents. Security, strategic operations. Your own team, eventually." The cartel leader's expression turned almost wistful. "Do you know how rare it is to find someone with your level of training who isn't already working for a government or buried in the ground? Someone who understands discipline and loyalty. The cartels are full of thugs like my nephew. Eager, violent, but ultimately replaceable." Hawk remained silent, his mind racing through scenarios, seeking weaknesses. "An escape route. Go home, Mr. Hawkins," Diego said. "Release Mr. Suarez," he ordered his men in Spanish. "Ensure he reaches town safely." The guards hesitated, clearly surprised. "Now!" Diego's voice hardened. As Miguel was escorted to a vehicle, Diego turned back to Hawk. "Consider my offer. Think about what you could protect with resources at your disposal. Think about the alternative." Hawk began backing toward the perimeter, his weapons still trained on Diego. "I meant what I said earlier. I'm not interested. Everyone has a price, Mr. Hawkins. For some, it's money. For others," Diego gestured toward Miguel's departing vehicle, "well, we'll discover yours soon enough." Hawk disappeared into the darkness, retreating to his extraction point where Bill waited. The mission had failed in its primary objective. He'd had to reveal himself without securing Miguel personally. But Miguel was being released. A partial victory at best, a deeper entanglement at worst. When they reached town, Miguel's wife was already calling everyone with news of his mysterious return. Dropped off at his front door with a warning to keep his grocery store open for business as usual, and an envelope containing $10,000 in cash. Compensation for the inconvenience. Sheriff Denton met Hawk at the diner's back door, his expression grave. "They're buying the town piece by piece, testing who'll bend and who'll break. And now they know I'm a problem," Hawk said, cleaning his weapon methodically. The familiar, routine centered him, pushed back the frustration of failure. "What happens next?" Bill asked, the old soldier recognizing the look of a man plotting his next move. Hawk reassembled his Glock with a final decisive click. They've identified themselves as predators, made their intentions clear, established their hierarchy. "And?" Sheriff Denton pressed. In combat, once you've identified the enemy command structure, you don't negotiate, Hawk said quietly. You eliminate it. The first attempt had failed, but he'd gathered critical intelligence, identified vulnerabilities. The next phase would be different. The hunt had begun. 3 days had passed since the failed extraction. 3 days of watchful waiting. 3 days of Hawk serving pancakes and burgers with mechanical precision, while his mind processed intelligence and formulated strategies. Miguel's grocery store had reopened. Business as usual, except for the new delivery trucks that arrived after hours and the nervous glances Miguel cast towards certain customers. The cartel's distribution network was taking shape. Miguel's store serving as one hub, with others undoubtedly established throughout the county. Hawk maintained normal operating hours at the diner, but after closing, he ventured out under cover of darkness, monitoring cartel movements, identifying patterns, building his target profile. Each night he returned with new intelligence, guard rotations, vehicle schedules, communication protocols. He was building a comprehensive operational picture, preparing for a coordinated strike that would dismantle the entire local network simultaneously. On the 4th morning, Sheriff Denton entered the diner for his usual breakfast, but something was off. His uniform was uncharacteristically wrinkled. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. He sat at the counter, avoiding direct eye contact with Hawk. "Coffee, Sheriff?" Sally asked, already pouring his usual cup. Denton nodded absently, his gaze fixed on his hands. When Sally moved away to serve other customers, he finally looked up at Hawk. "We need to talk," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not here." Hawk wiped his hands on his apron. "Freezer needs checking." "Sally, watch the grill." In the walk-in freezer, their breath fogged in the cold air as Denton glanced nervously at the door. "What happened?" Hawk asked. "They came to my house last night." Denton's voice cracked. "While I was on night shift. My wife was alone. They left pictures. My daughter at her dorm. My wife at her doctor's appointment. Both with lasers pointed at them through rifle scopes." Hawk felt the familiar cold anger settling in his chest. "Did they hurt them?" "No. Just the photos. And a message." Denton swallowed hard. "They want me to arrest you. Today. Public spectacle. Charges of assault against Mateo Vega, who's apparently planning to file a formal complaint." "On what evidence?" "They don't need evidence. They have leverage." Denton's hands shook. "They promised if I do this, my family stays safe. If I don't..." The implication hung in the freezing air between them. "I understand," Hawk said quietly. "I can't..." "Yes, you can," Hawk interrupted. "And you will." Denton looked up, confusion evident in his bloodshot eyes. "Arrest me. Make it public. Do exactly what they want." Hawk's mind was already calculating this new variable, adjusting the operational plan. "It protects your family and gives me what I need. Access." "Access to what?" "You'll be in a cell." Hawk's smile held no warmth. "Where do you think they're holding their product before distribution? The county jail is the best security in town. It's the perfect storage facility if you control the sheriff." Understanding dawned on Denton's face, followed quickly by shame. I didn't know, but now you do," Hawk said, "which means we can use it." 2 hours later, Sheriff Denton returned to the diner with his deputy. The arrest was exactly as the cartel had choreographed it. Public, humiliating, designed to show the town that resistance would be punished. Customers watched in stunned silence as Hawk was handcuffed and led to the patrol car. "You have the right to remain silent," Denton recited mechanically, performing his role for whoever might be watching. Sally stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. Bill Tennant watched from his usual seat, his expression unreadable, but his posture rigid with suppressed fury. As Hawk was placed in the back of the patrol car, he caught sight of a black SUV parked across the street. Diego Hernandez sat behind the wheel, watching with evident satisfaction. Their eyes met briefly. Hawk allowed a flash of defeat to cross his face, giving Diego what he expected to see. The facade crumbled the moment they were out of public view. "The keyring on your belt," Hawk said quietly from the back seat. "Hand it to me when you process me. The evidence lockup key is what I need." Denton nodded, almost imperceptibly. "They've got a shipment coming tonight. Major one, based on the security adjustments I've been told to make. Clearing out the west cell block. Restricting access to trusted deputies only." "How many deputies are compromised?" "Martinez for sure. Probably Jefferson. The others, I don't know." Hawk processed this information. 3 deputies total, plus Sheriff Denton. 2 possibly working for the cartel. Unfavorable odds, but manageable. "When you process me," Hawk continued. Make sure the charges keep me overnight but won't stick long-term. Simple assault, not aggravated. No weapons charges. You've got something specific in mind, Denton observed, a hint of his old sharpness, returning now that they were taking action rather than simply reacting. You could say that, Hawk replied, but you'll need deniability for what comes next. At the station, Hawk was photographed, fingerprinted, and placed in a holding cell with mechanical efficiency. Denton performed his role flawlessly, maintaining the appearance of professional detachment while discreetly passing the K-ring during processing. To any observer, nothing would have seemed amiss. As night fell, Hawk lay on the thin mattress of his cell, counting the minutes, listening to the rhythms of the small-town jail. The night deputy's coffee break at 11:17 p.m. The perimeter check at midnight. The evidence lockup being accessed at 12:22 a.m. Heavier footsteps than usual, multiple individuals. The pieces were falling into place. But something still didn't add up. Why would Diego expose his operation to Hawk by having him arrested? Why reveal the jail connection at all? The cartel leader was too strategic for such an obvious error, unless this too was part of a larger plan. At 1:43 a.m., Hawk made his move. The key Denton had provided allowed him to slip from his cell during the camera's programmed blind spot. Another piece of intelligence Denton had provided. Moving silently through the darkened corridors, Hawk navigated to the west cell block that had been cleared for the cartel's use. What he found there stopped him cold. It wasn't drugs. It was people. A dozen young women huddled on thin mattresses, eyes vacant from sedation or trauma. Human trafficking victims. The cartel's other enterprise. Hawk's blood ran cold as the full picture suddenly crystallized. Pine Creek wasn't just a distribution hub for drugs. Its strategic location made it perfect for moving people as well. Halfway between major cities, minimal law enforcement presence, easy access to transportation networks. As he assessed the situation, calculating how to get these women to safety, a slow clap echoed from the shadows. Impressive, Mr. Hawkins. Truly. Diego emerged from the darkness, flanked by Mateo and two deputies, Martinez and Jefferson, both holding service. Weapons trained on Hawk, exactly as I predicted. The hero couldn't resist investigating. Hawk kept his expression neutral, mind racing through tactical options. 4 armed opponents, civilians present, confined space, extremely unfavorable conditions. This was never about drugs, he said, playing for time while scanning for weaknesses. Escape routes. Drugs are merely profitable. This, Diego gestured to the women, is the future. These merchandise units will generate millions over their useful lifespan in the right markets. Merchandise units, Hawk repeated, the cold fury building behind his calm exterior. They're people. Their inventory, Diego corrected. And you, Mr. Hawkins, have been the final test of our security protocols. We needed to verify that our local law enforcement assets were truly reliable under pressure. He nodded toward the deputies. They passed admirably. Sheriff Denton as well, though. His family leverage makes him less versatile than these gentlemen, who operate purely on financial motivation. Hawk realized the trap had been sprung perfectly. He'd walked into exactly the scenario Diego had orchestrated. I must thank you, Diego continued. Your military background made you the perfect stress test. If our operation could withstand scrutiny, from someone with your training and skills, it can certainly handle routine law enforcement attention. Is that why you've kept me alive? As a test? Diego smiled. Partially, but also because men with your specific talents are rare. I offered you a position once. That offer remains open. Hawk glanced at the traumatized women, then back at Diego. I'll pass. Unfortunate, but not unexpected. Your moral code is admirable, if impractical. Diego sighed theatrically. In that case, I'm afraid this is where your story ends, Mr. Hawkins. The deputies raised their weapons. Mateo smiled eagerly, clearly hoping for the privilege of the kill. Sheriff, Denton will report that you escaped custody and had to be eliminated while resisting recapture, Diego explained. A regrettable incident that will remind the townspeople of the consequences of defiance. Hawk stood perfectly still, evaluating angles, distances, probabilities. The odds were beyond unfavorable. They were impossible. 4 armed men, positioned. For optimal coverage. No cover available, no weapons within reach. Any last words, Marine? Mateo taunted, his finger tightening on the trigger. The overhead lights suddenly went out, plunging the cell block into darkness. A heartbeat later, the emergency generators kicked in, bathing everything in dim red light. In that crucial moment of confusion, The cell block door burst open. Bill Tennant entered first, Vietnam-era M19-111, pistol leading the way. Behind him came Sally, wielding a shotgun with surprising confidence, and 3 other townspeople, Hawk recognized as veterans from his occasional PTSD support gatherings. The cavalry had arrived, chaos erupted, gunfire, shouts, the women screaming. Hawk dove for cover, rolling beneath a desk as bullets splintered the wood above him. When he emerged seconds later, the situation had transformed. Both corrupt deputies were down, wounded but alive. Mateo was engaged in a desperate hand-to-hand struggle with Bill, the older veteran's combat experience, compensating for his age against the younger man's strength. Diego was gone. He ran for the back exit, Sally shouted, covering the women protectively. 30 seconds ago. Without hesitation, Hawk sprinted after the cartel leader. The hunt was on, but now the stakes had changed fundamentally. This wasn't just about protecting his town from drugs. It was about human lives. About stopping an operation that treated people as commodities. The mission parameters had shifted. The rules of engagement had changed. This had just become personal. Rain had begun to fall as Hawk burst through the jail's rear exit, scanning the parking lot with combat-honed precision. A vehicle peeled away in the distance, Diego making his escape. But the cartel leader had made a critical error in his haste. He'd taken the most direct route back to the hunting lodge compound. Hawk knew these roads better, knew the shortcuts and the terrain. Within minutes, he was in Sheriff Denton's patrol car, lights off, racing along back roads toward the inevitable confrontation. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof of the vehicle. Lightning flashed, momentarily illuminating the dense forest that bordered the narrow county road. The conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Poor visibility, slick surfaces, limited auditory awareness. For most people, these would be disadvantages. For Hawk, they were tactical opportunities. He abandoned the patrol car a mile from the compound, concealing it in the underbrush before continuing on foot. The rain soaked him immediately, but he welcomed it. The downpour would mask his approach, wash away tracks, and degrade the effectiveness of any surveillance equipment. Moving through the forest with practiced silence, Hawk avoided the main entrance completely. His earlier reconnaissance had identified a drainage culvert that provided access beneath the perimeter fence, a vulnerability in the compound's security that Diego's men had overlooked. The compound was in chaos. Diego's sudden return had triggered emergency protocols. Guards rushed to defensive positions. Vehicles were being loaded, communications equipment dismantled. They were evacuating, destroying evidence, and preparing to disappear. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief illumination, Hawk spotted Diego directing operations from the main building's covered porch. The cartel leader was shouting orders, gesturing emphatically, his usual composure fractured by the unexpected compromise of his operation. Hawk calculated distances, angles, wind correction. From his position, it would be a 317-yard shot through, deteriorating weather conditions, challenging but achievable. He could end this now. 1 shot, 1 kill, mission complete. His finger tensed on the trigger. Then he saw them, 3 young women being forced into an SUV at gunpoint. More merchandise being moved before law enforcement could respond. If he took the shot, eliminated Diego, those women would still disappear into the cartel's trafficking network. The operation would continue under new management. The supply chain would remain intact. Hawk eased his finger off the trigger. The mission had evolved beyond eliminating a single target. Success now required dismantling the entire network, securing evidence, rescuing victims, ensuring prosecutions that would stick. Changing tactics, he circled the perimeter, using the storm as cover to approach the vehicle staging area. 4 SUVs were being loaded with equipment and personnel. The third vehicle contained the women, guarded by a single armed man, while the others focused on evacuation procedures. Hawk timed his approach to coincide with a thunderclap. Emerging from the darkness directly behind the guard, one precise strike to the brainstem rendered the man unconscious before he could raise an alarm. Hawk secured the guard's weapon, then turned to the terrified women. "U.S. Marine," he whispered, showing them his old military ID. "I'm getting you out. Stay quiet. Follow exactly." Their eyes reflected disbelief, hope, terror, the emotional cocktail of those who've been abused too many times to trust easily. But they nodded, following as he led them into the concealing darkness of the forest. The escape was almost clean. Almost. They were 50 yards into the trees when a shout went up. The women had been discovered missing. Flashlight beams cut through, The rain, searching the perimeter. Dog handlers were summoned, the animals barking audible even over the storm. "We need to move faster," Hawk urged, helping one woman who had stumbled on the uneven ground. "My vehicle is half a mile northeast." "They'll catch us," the youngest woman whispered, her accent Eastern European. "They always catch us." "Not tonight," Hawk promised, his voice carrying the unwavering certainty that had once steadied terrified Marines in combat situations. "Stay with me, do exactly as I say." The pursuit was gaining ground. Trained men with dogs against exhausted, traumatized women moving through unfamiliar terrain in a storm. The odds were deteriorating rapidly. Decision point: continue fleeing or create a diversion. Hawk chose the latter. Using the guard's confiscated radio, he switched to the cartel's operational frequency. "Southeast perimeter breached," he transmitted, disguising his voice with a passable Spanish accent. "Multiple targets, armed." The response was immediate. Half the search team diverted, racing toward the non-existent threat. But it wouldn't buy much time. Diego was too experienced to fall for such a basic deception for long. They reached the patrol car with moments to spare. As Hawk helped the last woman into the vehicle, headlights appeared on the road ahead. Cartel vehicles establishing a roadblock. "Stay down," he instructed, calculating options. Going back wasn't possible. The compound was now on full alert. Going forward meant confrontation. He accelerated directly toward the roadblock, reaching for the patrol car's radio. "Sheriff Denton, this is Hawk. Emergency situation. 3 civilians in my vehicle. Roadblock ahead at County Marker 17. Requesting immediate backup." The response came not from Denton, but from Bill Tennant. "Cavalry's already rolling, son. Hold tight." Hawk allowed himself a grim smile. The veterans of Pine Creek had mobilized. The roadblock loomed ahead, 2 SUVs positioned across the narrow road, armed men taking cover behind them. Hawk assessed the tactical situation in seconds. The roadblock was well executed, but had one critical flaw. It assumed he would attempt to avoid collision. "Brace yourselves," he warned the women as he targeted the precise point where the 2 SUVs met. The weakest link in the blockade. Physics and momentum were now his allies. The patrol car hit the gap at 60 miles per hour, the reinforced push bumper designed for pit maneuvers acting as a battering ram. Metal screamed against metal as the SUVs were forced apart, creating just enough space for the patrol car to burst through in a shower of broken glass and twisted metal. Cartel gunmen opened fire, bullets pinging off the reinforced vehicle. Hawk maintained speed, putting distance between them and their pursuers. In the rearview mirror, he saw 3 pickup trucks crest the hill behind them. Local vehicles driven by veterans who'd responded to Bill's call for assistance. The cartel's roadblock team found themselves suddenly outflanked and outgunned by determined men who'd fought in Vietnam, Desert Storm, and more recent conflicts. Men who understood tactical advantage and weren't inhibited by rules of engagement when protecting their town. Hawk drove straight to the county hospital, where Sheriff Denton was waiting with state police and FBI agents who'd responded to reports of human trafficking. The women were immediately taken into protective custody, medical care and translator services already arranged. "Diego?" Denton asked quietly, as emergency personnel swarmed around them. "Still out there," Hawk replied. "But running," the sheriff's expression hardened. "Not for long. We've got roadblocks on every major highway, state police helicopter incoming. The FBI has jurisdiction now, human trafficking across state lines." Hawk nodded, but knew the truth that Denton didn't want to face. Diego Hernandez hadn't survived this long by being easy to catch. The cartel leader had escape plans, false identities, offshore resources. Traditional law enforcement methods were unlikely to succeed. As dawn broke over Pine Creek, casting long shadows across rain-slicked streets, Hawk stood outside the hospital, watching FBI agents process evidence and interview witnesses. The system was working as designed, victims rescued, evidence secured, prosecutions being prepared. But the mission wasn't complete, not while Diego remained free. The hunt had only begun. "You've caused me significant inconvenience, Mr. Hawkins." Diego's voice emanated from the diner's wall-mounted phone. The call routed through so many proxies that even the FBI's trace attempts were futile. 3 days had passed since the raid. 3 days of federal agents swarming Pine Creek, cataloging evidence from the compound, interviewing locals, building their case. 3 days of Diego in the wind, location unknown. Hawk held the receiver, his expression betraying nothing to the FBI agents recording the call nearby. "Inconvenience seems mild. I'd estimate your losses at 8 figures minimum. 32 arrests, 17 trafficking victims rescued, 4 properties seized." Diego's laugh held no humor. Inventory and infrastructure can be replaced. My organization has depth you cannot comprehend. Then why call? Hawk asked, cutting through the posturing. A pause. Professional courtesy. One hunter to another. The agents exchanged glances. This wasn't the typical cartel intimidation call they'd expected. You interfered with my business, Diego continued. Normally, such interference would be answered with overwhelming force against you and everyone you care about. The typical cartel response. But you've earned a more professional consideration. I'm offering you 24 hours. For what? To leave. Take your diner employees, your sheriff friend, those veterans who've been standing guard. Disappear. Start over somewhere my organization doesn't operate. Hawk's grip tightened on the receiver. And if we stay? Then I demonstrate. Why challenging a cartel has consequences that extend beyond the individual. Your entire town becomes an example. Diego's voice hardened. This isn't a negotiation, Mr. Hawkins. It's professional courtesy that expires in 24 hours. The line went dead. The lead FBI agent, Reynolds, immediately approached. We need to get protective details on everyone associated with you. That was a credible threat from a subject with demonstrated capability. Hawk shook his head. You don't have the manpower to protect an entire town. We can request additional federal resources, which won't arrive before his deadline. Hawk moved to the diner windows, scanning the street outside with habitual vigilance. Diego wouldn't have made that call unless he was already prepared to act. Assets in place, plan developed. Sheriff Denton entered the diner, his expression grim. Just got word from the roadblock at the county line. Deputy Ferguson's missing. Radio check failed. Vehicle found abandoned. The first casualty. The escalation had begun. By nightfall, the threat had materialized with ruthless efficiency. A local farmer's barn burned to the ground. The message 24 hours spelled out in gasoline and set ablaze in the adjacent field. The town's water supply showed traces of contamination, forcing a shutdown of municipal systems. 3 more locals with connections to Hawk disappeared. The high school principal, who'd let him use the gym for veteran support meetings. The hardware store owner, who lived below his apartment. The elderly pharmacist, who supplied medications to veterans when VA bureaucracy moved too slowly. Diego was demonstrating his reach, showing that distance and federal protection meant nothing against an organization with his resources. An emergency meeting convened at the diner, now serving as the town's command center. Sheriff Denton, their remaining deputies, FBI agent Reynolds, and local veterans crowded around tables pushed together in the main dining area. We've got to evacuate the town, Reynolds insisted. It's the only way to ensure civilian safety until we can locate and neutralize Hernandez. Evacuate to where? Bill Tennant demanded. There are over 2,000 people in Pine Creek. How many can your agency protect indefinitely? How many will have homes to return to if we abandon them to the cartel? The argument continued as Hawk studied the map spread across the counter. Diego's warning had been specific. Leave town, all of them, or face consequences. The cartel leader was forcing a choice between abandonment or destruction, but there was a third option that Diego hadn't considered. We take the fight to him, Hawk said quietly, his voice nonetheless cutting through the heated debate. All eyes turned to him. What are you proposing? Reynolds asked, professional skepticism evident in his tone. Diego's ultimatum tells us something. Critical. He's close, within striking distance. Hawk circled areas on the map. The incidents since his call have all been coordinated. Precision targets with minimal collateral damage. That's not long-distance management. That's direct operational control. Sheriff Denton leaned forward. You think he's still in the area? With federal agents crawling over every inch of the county. I know he is. Hawk's certainty was absolute. Diego's background is military. His training taught the same principles as mine. Never abandon the high ground. Pine Creek represents too significant an investment and strategic position. He won't release his claim on it. So where is he? Reynolds challenged. Hawk tapped the map at a location 15 miles outside town. The old mining complex, self-contained power generation, multiple access points, underground facilities that don't appear on public records, defensible position with excellent visibility of approaching vehicles. How could you possibly know that? Reynolds demanded. Because it's where I would go, Hawk replied simply. And Diego thinks the way I do, the FBI agent shook his head. That's not enough to justify a federal raid. We need evidence, probable cause. Then I'll get you evidence, Hawk said, meeting Reynolds' skeptical gaze. But we need to move faster than federal protocols allow. Diego's 24-hour deadline expires at dawn. What exactly are you suggesting? Sheriff Denton asked, though his expression suggested he already knew. Reconnaissance, confirmation, intelligence gathering. Hawk's eyes swept the room, lingering on the veterans who'd stood with him at the jail. Small team, minimum footprint, no direct engagement unless absolutely necessary. Reynolds started to object, but Sheriff Denton cut him off. This is still my jurisdiction, Agent Reynolds. If Mr. Hawkins and these other private citizens choose to go hunting on public land near the old mining complex tonight, that's their right as Americans. The FBI agent recognized the determination in the room. These men wouldn't be stopped by federal authority or bureaucratic objections, not with their town under threat. If you find evidence, Reynolds conceded reluctantly, call it in immediately. No heroics, no private war. He fixed Hawk with a hard stare. I mean it. Confirmation only. The arrest is ours. Hawk nodded his agreement, though everyone present recognized the unspoken reality. Once they located Diego, events would develop according to their own momentum. The confrontation that had been building since the cartel first arrived in Pine Creek was reaching its inevitable climax. Within the hour, Hawk and 4 veterans were geared up and ready. They gathered behind the diner, checking communications equipment and weapons brought out from long-stored gun safes. Men who hadn't worn tactical gear in decades moved with renewed purpose, muscle memory returning as they adjusted straps and checked sightlines. Just like old times, Bill murmured, his weathered hands steady on his rifle. Though my knees are going to regret this tomorrow. Assuming we live to see tomorrow, another veteran replied with gallows humor. Hawk surveyed his impromptu team. Not the young Marines he'd once led, but experienced fighters with something worth fighting for. Their age was offset by intimate knowledge of the terrain and the steadiness that comes from having faced death before. Rules of engagement, he said quietly. We confirm Diego's location. Gather evidence for the FBI. Extract without detection, if possible. And if not possible, Bill asked. Hawk checked his weapon one final time. Then we remind the cartel why coming to our town was their last mistake. As they moved out under cover of darkness, none of them voiced the understanding that hung in the air. This mission wasn't just about gathering intelligence. It was about ending the threat to their home, permanently. Diego had escalated the conflict from intimidation to warfare. Now he would face opponents who understood warfare all too well. Moonlight filtered through broken clouds as Hawk and his team approached the abandoned mining complex. The 5 men moved in staggered formation, utilizing natural cover, minimizing their silhouettes against the horizon. Their progress was slow but deliberate, the careful advance of experienced operators rather than the rushed deployment of amateurs. 2 miles from the objective, Hawk signaled a halt with a raised fist. Something was wrong. The night was too quiet. No wildlife sounds. No distant generator hum that would indicate an occupied facility. Perimeter security, he whispered to Bill, who had naturally fallen into the role of second-in-command. Motion sensors or observation posts. Bill nodded, understanding immediately. Tripwire. The team adjusted their approach, moving now with painstaking precision, checking each step for pressure plates or detection devices. Their caution was rewarded when Hawk spotted the nearly invisible filament stretched across the game trail they'd been following. A primitive but effective alarm system that would have announced their approach. Professionals would have better tech, Frank Weathers, a Desert Storm veteran, observed as they carefully bypassed the tripwire. They do, Hawk confirmed, pointing to a small device camouflaged in a nearby tree, a thermal imaging camera feeding to a remote monitoring station. The tripwire is the backup, or the distraction. They avoided 3 more such setups as they closed in on the mining complex. The security measures grew more sophisticated nearer the facility, evidence that someone with resources and training had established defensive positions. From a ridgeline overlooking the main compound, Hawk used night vision binoculars to survey the target. The facility appeared abandoned at first glance. No exterior lights, no visible movement. But subtle indicators told a different story. Fresh tire tracks in the muddy access road. Condensation patterns on buildings indicating climate. Control inside, recently disturbed ground, where communications equipment had been installed. Most telling was the systematic patrol pattern of guards, not the random movements of bored security personnel, but the disciplined rotation of trained operators maintaining defensive positions. Hawk counted 6 visible guards, which suggested at least 12 total, assuming standard rotation protocols. That's a military-grade operation, Bill whispered, observing through his own binoculars. Not typical cartel security. Diego was special forces before joining the cartel, Hawk explained. He's recreated what he knows. The team documented everything. Guard positions, patrol timing, entry points, defensive vulnerabilities. The evidence Reynolds had demanded was accumulating rapidly, but as the night progressed, Hawk's expression grew increasingly grim. "What's wrong?" Bill asked during a brief rest period. "We're getting what we came for." Hawk handed over the binoculars, directing Bill's attention to a specific building. "Vehicle bay, east side, count the transport capacity." Bill studied the area, then swore softly. 5 SUVs, 2 cargo vans, enough to move at least 30 people plus equipment. Exactly. Hawk's voice was tight with controlled anger. "They're not settling in. They're preparing for extraction. The 24-hour deadline wasn't just for us. It was their timetable. The implications were clear. By dawn, Diego and his operation would be gone, relocated to another territory, another town. That would suffer the same infiltration Pine Creek had experienced. "We need to call Reynolds," Frank insisted. "Get the FBI here now. Minimum 4 hours for a full tactical response team to mobilize and deploy," Hawk countered. "Dawn is in 3 hours." The veterans exchanged glances, the unspoken question hanging in the night air. Proceed as planned with intelligence gathering only, or adapt to the changing situation. For Hawk, there was no question. His mission had evolved from the moment he'd seen those women being trafficked. This was no longer about protecting his diner or even Pine Creek. It was about stopping an organization that treated human beings as merchandise. "New objective," he said quietly. "We need to delay their departure until federal assets can arrive." Bill nodded, his Vietnam-hardened eyes reflecting understanding. "Sabotage." "Precisely. Vehicle incapacitation. Communications disruption. Nothing directly engaging cartel personnel unless absolutely necessary." It was a dangerous escalation, but a calculated one. Buying time could mean the difference between Diego's operation, continuing elsewhere, or ending permanently. The team split into 2 elements. Hawk and Bill would approach the communications array on the north side of the compound. Frank and the other 2 veterans would target the vehicle bay to the east. Synchronized watches, 30 minutes to get into position. Execute at exactly 0400 hours. Rendezvous at the extraction point by 0430. Simple, direct, minimal variables. Except in combat, variables always multiply. Hawk and Bill reached their objective without incident, identifying the satellite communications equipment that served as the compound's connection to the outside world. A shaped charge, placed precisely, would disable it without creating enough noise to immediately alert the entire security team. As Hawk prepared the explosive, a movement at the main building caught his attention. Through his scope, he observed Diego emerging with Mateo and 2 guards, heading toward a helipad previously hidden from their observation angle. The timeline had accelerated. They weren't waiting until dawn. "Change of plans," he whispered to Bill. "They're bugging out now." Before Bill could respond, gunfire erupted from the eastern side of the compound, sharp staccato bursts of automatic weapons fire, followed by the deeper boom of shotguns. Frank's team had been compromised. Chaos erupted across the compound. Guards raced toward the commotion. Lights blazed to life. The helicopter's engines began spooling up. "Decision point. Abort or adapt. Set the charge," Hawk ordered. "Execute in 3 minutes. I'm going to extract our people." Bill's protest died on his lips as Hawk was already moving, flowing through shadows toward the firefight with the fluid grace of a predator. Through his scope, Hawk quickly assessed the situation. Frank and 1 other veteran had taken cover behind a maintenance shed, pinned down by fire from multiple directions. The 3rd team member was down, condition unknown. 4 cartel gunmen were closing in on their position, while others maintained suppressing fire. Hawk regulated his breathing, settling into the calm focus that had made him a devastating force on the battlefield. Distance, 3 and 17 yards. Wind, negligible. Target priority, gunman maneuvering to flank Frank's position. Inhale, half exhale, hold. The first shot broke the night's tension like a thunderclap. The flanking gunman dropped instantly. Before the others could react, Hawk had cycled his bolt and acquired his second target. Another shot, another hit. The cartel forces suddenly found themselves under precise, devastating fire from an unseen position. Their coordinated assault faltered as they sought cover from the invisible threat. The distraction gave Frank enough time to drag his wounded teammate toward better cover. Hawk provided covering fire, each shot finding its mark with surgical precision. In the compound, the helicopter lifted off, banking sharply to escape the unexpected firefight. Through his scope, Hawk caught a glimpse of Diego's face in the open door. Not panicked, but coldly furious. The cartel leader was escaping. The thought had barely registered when a deafening explosion rocked the northern side of the compound. Bill had detonated the shaped charge on the communications array, adding to the chaos. Secondary explosions followed as fuel tanks ignited, sending columns of flame into the night sky. Hawk continued providing precision fire support as Frank and his team began extracting toward the rendezvous point. The tide had turned momentarily. The cartel forces disorganized, their leadership evacuated, their communications disrupted. But the helicopter carrying Diego was already disappearing into the night, and reinforcements would undoubtedly be summoned. They needed to withdraw immediately. Hawk fired his last covering shot, then began his own extraction. The mission had failed in its primary objective. Diego had escaped, but succeeded in disrupting the cartel's operations. More importantly, his team had documented enough evidence to justify a full federal response. As they regrouped at the rendezvous point, assessing injuries and accounting for all personnel, distant sirens announced the approach of law enforcement. Someone had reported the gunfire and explosions. "Reynolds is going to be pissed," Bill observed dryly, helping support the wounded veteran who had taken shrapnel to his leg but would recover. "He'll have his evidence," Hawk replied, already planning their next move. "And we've bought time." Disrupted their extraction. Diego got away, but his operation is compromised. The team made it back to town just as dawn broke over Pine Creek. FBI agents and state police were already mobilizing in response to the reports of explosions and gunfire at the mining complex. Reynolds stormed over to where Hawk was, helping the wounded veteran into Sheriff Denton's patrol car for transport to the hospital. "What part of intelligence gathering only was unclear to you, Hawkins?" the agent demanded, face flushed with anger. Hawk handed over a memory card containing their surveillance footage. "They were extracting early. We adapted to the situation." Reynolds examined the card, his professional interest temporarily overriding his fury. "Diego escaped by helicopter, heading southwest, based on departure vector." The FBI agent's expression shifted as he processed this information. "We'll get alerts to all airfields within range. Border Patrol is already on standby." He fixed Hawk with a hard stare. "This isn't over, you know. You interfered with a federal investigation. There will be consequences." "I understand." Hawk wasn't concerned with bureaucratic threats. His focus had already shifted to the next phase. Diego had escaped, but his operation was crippled. The cartel leader would regroup, reassess, and then, "He'll come back," Hawk said with absolute certainty. Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "What makes you so sure?" "Because I know how he thinks. This isn't just business anymore, it's personal." The Last Shot diner reopened 3 days later. The gesture was symbolic. A return to normalcy. A statement that Pine Creek wouldn't be intimidated into abandoning their daily routines. The townspeople responded by filling every seat, the breakfast rush extending well into the afternoon, as locals came to show support and exchange information. Between flipping pancakes and refilling coffee cups, Hawk observed the subtle changes in his community. The veterans who'd participated in the raid sat at the counter, receiving handshakes and thanks from neighbors who didn't know the details, but understood something significant had happened. Sheriff Denton moved through the crowd, his authority restored now that the corrupted deputies had been removed. FBI agents occupied a corner booth, maintaining a visible presence while the investigation continued. But beneath the veneer of recovery, Hawk sensed the tension. Everyone knew this wasn't over. "Any word on Diego?" he asked quietly, when Reynolds stopped at the counter for coffee. The agent shook his head. "Helicopter was found abandoned near the Texas border. He's gone underground, but his operation here is finished. We've seized all the properties, arrested 27 cartel members, rescued another 9 trafficking victims from a secondary location." "You sound almost disappointed," Sally observed, refilling the agent's cup. Reynolds grimaced. "We wanted Diego. The rest are replaceable parts in his organization." Hawk understood the frustration. In Afghanistan, eliminating mid-level Taliban, commanders had provided temporary victories but rarely changed the strategic situation. Only by targeting leadership could you genuinely disrupt an adversary's operations. As the day progressed, Hawk maintained his routine while continuously scanning for threats, assessing each customer who entered, watching the street through the windows. The habits of combat never truly disappeared. The constant vigilance, the tactical awareness, the mental preparation for sudden violence. During a brief lull between lunch and dinner service, Marco called. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," his former spotter said without preamble. "DEA intercepts show a price on your head, 7 figures. Hawk absorbed this information calmly. Expected. Diego doesn't handle humiliation well. This isn't just about ego, brother. The cartel lost millions in product, personnel, and property because of you. Their distribution network is compromised. Rival organizations are already moving to take advantage of their weakness. So they need to make an example, Hawk concluded. Restore their reputation. Exactly. And not just with you. The entire town is marked. My sources say Diego is personally directing the response operation. The information confirmed what Hawk had already suspected. Time frame? Hard to say. Days, not weeks. They're gathering specialized assets, not street soldiers, professional hitters with military backgrounds, the kind of people who can handle someone with your training. Hawk thanked him for the warning and ended the call, his mind already calculating options, contingencies, response to scenarios. Diego would come with overwhelming force, expecting resistance. The cartel leader wouldn't underestimate him again. Sheriff Denton arrived as Hawk was closing up for the night, his expression grave. Just got word from the FBI. 3 former Special Forces operators with cartel connections crossed the border yesterday, known associates of Diego. Bill Tennant, who'd taken to spending evenings at the diner since the raid, looked up from his newspaper. Sounds like our party invitation just got upgraded. The sheriff wasn't amused. This isn't a joke. Reynolds is requesting additional federal resources. But bureaucracy moves slowly. We're looking at 48 hours minimum before any meaningful reinforcements arrive. And Diego will move before then, Hawk stated with certainty. So what's the play? Bill asked, the old soldier's instincts coming to the fore. Hawk considered their options. Evacuation wasn't viable, the town was too large, and Diego had demonstrated their age to target people even if they fled. Passive defense meant civilian casualties. Federal intervention would come too late, which left one option. Controlled offensive action. Set the battlefield. Choose the ground. Dictate the terms of engagement. We need to make this personal for Diego, Hawk said finally. Draw him in. Make him focus on me specifically rather than the town at large. Sheriff Denton frowned. You're suggesting using yourself as bait. I'm suggesting we control the narrative. Diego wants revenge against me. Fine, but on our terms, not his. Over the next 24 hours, a plan took shape. Veterans organized into informal defense teams. Sheriff Denton coordinated with neighboring counties for additional deputies. The townspeople prepared, converting businesses into potential strongpoints, establishing communication networks, identifying evacuation routes if needed. At the center of it all was the diner, Hawk's territory, the symbolic target that represented his presence in Pine Creek. If Diego wanted to make a statement, the diner would be the natural focal point. By the second evening, everything was in place. The last shot. Diner closed early, its windows dark, except for a single light in the kitchen where Hawk worked alone, a deliberate target for watching eyes. The street outside appeared deserted, but concealed carefully positioned defenders, veterans with hunting rifles in second-story windows, deputies in unmarked vehicles, FBI agents coordinating with state police assets staged just outside town. As midnight approached, Hawk finished his preparations in the kitchen. He moved with the same methodical precision he'd once used to set up sniper positions in hostile territory. Cooking implements repurposed as weapons, sightlines established. Escape, routes confirmed. The familiar calm of pre-mission focus settled over him as he waited for the inevitable. Bill entered through the back door, moving quietly, despite his age. Lookout spotted vehicles approaching from the south. No headlights. At least 3 SUVs. Hawk nodded, unsurprised. Diego's coming to finish what he started. You ready for this? Bill asked, checking his weapon with hands that had performed the same actions in jungles half a century earlier. Hawk looked around the diner. The humble establishment that had given him purpose after war had left him adrift. Here, among these, ordinary people who had become family, he had found something worth fighting for, beyond abstract concepts of duty and country. I've been ready since they walked through that door the first time, he replied. Let's end this. Outside, vehicle engines approached slowly, then stopped. Doors opened and closed with deliberate quiet. Armed men took positions around the diner, believing their movements concealed by darkness, unaware they were already under observation from multiple angles. The hunt that had begun when cartel thugs threatened a small-town diner was reaching its climax. But this time, the hunter had become the hunted, and a Marine Scout sniper with 84 confirmed kills was waiting for them. The first attack came at 2:17 a.m., a simultaneous assault from multiple angles. Suppressed weapons fire shattered the diner's windows as shadowy figures converged on the building with military precision. Their coordinated movement and fire discipline confirmed Marco's intelligence. These weren't common cartel soldiers, but specialized operators with tactical training. Hawk had anticipated this opening gambit. The kitchen light that had marked him as a target illuminated only an apron draped over a chair. A basic decoy that bought precious seconds as the assault team realized their primary target wasn't where expected. From his actual position behind the counter, Hawk assessed the situation with combat-honed clarity. 3-man team at the front entrance, 2 covering the rear. Sniper on the roof of the hardware store across the street, identifiable by the distinctive flash signature of his weapon. He keyed his radio once, a silent signal to the defenders positioned throughout the town that the attack had begun. The response was immediate but disciplined. No panicked return fire, no premature engagement. The veterans and deputies held position, allowing the cartel forces to commit fully to their assault before revealing the counter-ambush. The front door burst open as the lead assault team breached the diner, tactical lights mounted on their weapons, cutting through the darkness. They moved with practiced coordination, clearing corners, maintaining spacing, communicating with hand signals. Professional. Dangerous. Hawk waited until all 3 had entered before triggering the first surprise, a series of flashbang grenades he'd positioned beneath tables. The disorienting explosions of light and sound disrupted the assault team's cohesion momentarily. Enough time for Hawk to engage. His first shot dropped the point man instantly. His second caught the rear operator in the shoulder, a wounding shot designed to create additional confusion rather than a kill. The third attacker managed to return fire, bullets splintering the wooden counter as Hawk rolled to a pre-designated position behind the industrial refrigerator. Outside, the night erupted as the town's defenders engaged the cartel's support elements. Simultaneously, controlled pairs of rifle fire from concealed positions forced the cartel snipers to seek cover. Deputies in unmarked vehicles activated light bars and sirens, creating the impression of a larger law enforcement presence than actually existed. Hawk used the chaos to maneuver, circling behind the remaining attacker in the diner. The cartel operator sensed the movement too, late, turning just as Hawk closed the distance. What followed wasn't the stylized combat of films, but the brutal efficiency of close-quarters battle. A swift series of strikes targeting vulnerable points, ending with the operator unconscious on the linoleum floor. "Diner secured," Hawk reported into his radio as he zip-tied the unconscious men. 3 tangos down. "Status on perimeter," Bill's voice crackled in response. "East and north approaches holding. Cartel forces falling back to secondary positions. No visual on primary target yet. Primary target, Diego." The cartel leader was too experienced to expose himself during the initial assault. He would be watching, evaluating, adapting his strategy based on the unexpected resistance. Sheriff Denton's voice joined the channel. 2 deputies wounded at the south roadblock, not critical. FBI tactical units still 20 minutes out. 20 minutes might as well be 20 hours in combat. The situation would be resolved one way or another before federal assets arrived. Hawk moved to the diner's rear office, accessing the building's roof via a maintenance ladder. From this elevated position, he had visual coverage of the surrounding 4 blocks, enough to observe the cartel forces regrouping around 3 SUVs positioned strategically at intersection points. Their initial surprise attack had failed, but they were far from defeated. Through his scope, Hawk counted 17 operators still active, all wearing tactical gear, armed with military-grade weapons. More concerning was the equipment being unloaded from 1 vehicle. Heavier firepower, possibly including anti-structure munitions. This wasn't just an assassination attempt. It was a full-scale assault designed to destroy the town's resistance capacity in one overwhelming strike. Still, no visual on Diego. A new voice joined the radio channel. "Agent Reynolds, FBI, 2 minutes from the north perimeter. State police establishing roadblock to the south. Hold positions. 2 minutes." Hawk studied the cartel's deployment pattern, recognizing the preliminary movements of a secondary assault. They wouldn't wait for federal reinforcements to arrive. His suspicion was confirmed as one team advanced toward the diner again, this time using smoke grenades to conceal their approach. Simultaneously, others engaged the town's defensive positions with suppressive fire, attempting to pin down the veterans and deputies who had disrupted their initial attack. The battle was escalating beyond what the town's improvised defense could contain. Civilian structures weren't designed for combat. Non-professional defenders, regardless of past military experience, couldn't maintain coordination indefinitely against trained operators. Decision point. Continue the defensive stance or seize the initiative. Hawk chose the latter. All units, maintain suppressive fire on visible targets, he ordered through the radio. I'm moving to neutralize their command element. Before objections could be raised, he was already descending from the roof and exiting through the diner's basement delivery entrance. Years of running supply routes through mountain passes under Taliban observation had taught him how to move unseen, even in seemingly exposed terrain. He became a shadow weaving between structures, using thievery smoke deployed by the cartel to mask his approach to their command vehicles. The first cartel operator never saw him coming. A silent takedown from behind, the man unconscious before he could alert others. The second managed to turn partially before Hawk's strike incapacitated him. These weren't kills. These were precision neutralizations designed to reduce enemy combat effectiveness without creating the noise of gunfire that would compromise his position. He was 3 vehicles away from the command SUV when a familiar voice called out from behind him. Impressive as always, Mr. Hawkins. Hawk turned slowly to find Diego Hernandez standing 15 feet away, flanked by Mateo and 2 operators. All 4 had weapons trained on him. You knew I was coming, Hawk observed, keeping his hands visible but his posture balanced for potential movement. Diego inclined his head slightly. Acknowledgement between professionals. I counted on it. The urge to take direct action rather than delegate is a weakness we share. Is that why you came personally? To handle me yourself? Precisely. Diego's expression remained impassive, but his eyes revealed genuine respect beneath the hostility. Some matters require a personal touch. You've cost my organization considerably, not just in resources, but in reputation. Hawk assessed distances, angles, response times. 4 armed opponents at optimal firing distance. Minimal cover available. Extremely unfavorable conditions. The FBI is already here, he said, playing for time while calculating options. State police as well. Your window is closing. A minor inconvenience. We'll be gone before they can establish an effective perimeter. Diego gestured with his free hand toward the distant sound of sirens. But first, I'll conclude our business. Mateo stepped forward eagerly, his weapon aimed at Hawk's head. Let me do it, uncle. He humiliated me. My right toned him. Diego considered, for a moment then nodded. Make it quick. Professional. The younger man's face split in a vicious grin as he moved closer, too close for proper weapon handling. His mistake. Hawk recognized the error immediately. Mateo wanted the satisfaction of seeing fear in his victim's eyes. It was the difference between a professional and an amateur, regardless of training or experience. Any last words, Marine? Mateo, taunted, echoing their previous encounter at the jail. Hawk remained utterly still, his expression betraying nothing. Just 3. Poor trigger discipline. Mateo's confusion at the response created the microsecond of hesitation Hawk needed. In one fluid motion, he slapped the weapon's muzzle aside while simultaneously driving his other hand into Mateo's throat. Not with enough force to crush the windpipe, but sufficient to trigger an involuntary physical response that disrupted his motor control. The others opened fire immediately, but Hawk was already using Mateo as a shield, controlling his weapon arm. As bullets meant for him struck the younger man instead. The bitter irony of Mateo being killed by his own colleagues wasn't lost on Hawk, but combat allowed no room for reflection. Using the momentary chaos, he managed to reach partial cover behind a vehicle. Diego barked orders in Spanish, directing his men to flanking positions. The cartel leader's tactical acumen was evident in how quickly he adapted to the changing situation. Hawk was pinned down, outgunned, and running out of options when the night was suddenly illuminated by spotlight beams. Cutting through the smoke, FBI tactical units had arrived, their operators taking up positions with professional efficiency. Federal agents! Reynolds' voice boomed through a loudspeaker. Throw down your weapons! You are surrounded! The cartel operators hesitated, looking to Diego for direction. In that crucial moment of indecision, gunfire erupted from an unexpected quarter. Bill and the veterans had maneuvered to outflank the cartel position, catching them in a deadly crossfire between the town defenders and federal agents. Diego assessed the deteriorating situation with the cold calculation of a man accustomed to making life or death decisions. His operation was compromised beyond recovery, his forces outsurged and outpositioned. The mission had failed. 20 seconds to exfil, he said to his remaining men, already beginning a tactical retreat toward the last viable escape route, an alley leading to where secondary vehicles must be staged. Hawk emerged from cover, weapon trained on the cartel leader. It's over, Diego. Perhaps this phase, Diego acknowledged. still backing away, his own weapon leveled at Hawk in a perfect mirror of their standoff. But operations like mine don't end with the loss of a single team or territory. This one will. Hawk advanced steadily, undeterred by the weapon aimed at his chest. You won't leave Pine Creek. Around them, the firefight was ending as cartel operators surrendered or fell to combined federal and local fire. Diego's escape window was collapsing by the second. The cartel leader recognized the inevitability of the situation. With the practiced movement of a professional fighter, he shifted his aim and fired, not at Hawk, but at a nearby propane tank. The explosion created instant chaos, debris, smoke, confusion. Diego used the distraction to break for the alley at a full sprint. Hawk pursued immediately, ignoring the heat of flames and shouts of federal agents. This had become personal beyond the mission parameters. Diego represented not just the threat to Pine Creek, but the embodiment of predators who exploited the vulnerable, who treated human lives as commodities. The alley opened onto a side street, where a motorcycle stood ready, Diego's final contingency plan. The cartel leader had almost reached it when Hawk's shot rang out. Precision. Calculated. The bullet struck Diego's leg, a disabling rather than killing shot. The cartel leader collapsed mere feet from his escape vehicle, clutching his wound but already attempting to drag himself toward the motorcycle. His determination was remarkable, the mark of someone who had survived countless previous encounters through sheer will. Hawk approached cautiously, weapon still trained on his opponent. It's finished, Diego. The cartel leader looked up, blood seeping between his fingers as he pressed them against the wound. His gold tooth gleamed in the dim light as he offered a pained smile. Nothing is ever finished, Mr. Hawkins. Men like us, hunters, we are, merely replaced by those hungry for our positions. Cut off one head. Save the philosophy, Hawk interrupted, keeping a professional distance. Federal custody will give you plenty of time to contemplate the nature of your business. Diego's laugh held no humor. You think this ends with me? My organization has depth you cannot imagine. They will come for you, for your town, for everyone you... The cartel leader's monologue cut off abruptly as he lunged, drawing a concealed pistol from his ankle holster with practiced speed. But Hawk had anticipated the move. It was what he would have done in the same position. His response was instant, instinctive, and final. A single shot. Center mass. Diego Hernandez collapsed backward, the hidden weapon unfired in his hand. As federal agents swarmed the scene seconds later, Hawk stood motionless, his expression unreadable. The hunt was over. The predator neutralized. The mission complete. But, as he stared at Diego's body, he wondered if the cartel leader's final warning held truth. Was this truly an end? Or merely a pause before another threat emerged? Reynolds approached cautiously, his tactical team securing the area. It's over, Hawkins. Stand down. Hawk finally lowered his weapon, the combat focus receding as adrenaline ebbed. For now, the agent studied him with professional assessment. You know there'll be inquiries, investigations. This wasn't exactly by the book. It rarely is, Hawk replied simply. As dawn broke over Pine Creek, casting long shadows across streets marked by the night's violence, Hawk walked back toward the diner. The building stood damaged but intact, windows shattered, bullet holes, marking its walls, but still standing, like the town itself, like its people, resilient despite everything thrown against them. Sheriff Denton met him at the perimeter, his uniform dusty and torn, but his authority restored. Federal response teams are taking over. Cartel survivors in custody. 4 town defenders wounded, all stable. Hawk nodded, processing the information with the automatic assessment of a combat veteran. What happens now? The sheriff asked. Hawk looked toward the diner. His sanctuary turned battlefield, and now something else. Something that represented more than just a business or a cover for his damaged psyche. It had become a symbol of resistance against those who would prey on the vulnerable. We rebuild, he said simply. We stay vigilant. We remember what happened here. The battle was over. Diego was gone. But the war against predators never truly ended. That was a reality Hawk had accepted long ago in the mountains of Afghanistan. And now again in the small town he called home. Some warriors never truly retire. They merely find new missions worthy of their skills. 3 weeks after what locals now called the night, Pine Creek was healing. The physical damage had been addressed. First, broken windows replaced, bullet holes patched, burn marks painted over. The psychological wounds would take longer, but the community had already begun that process too, in their own way. The Last Shot Diner reopened on a Tuesday morning with little fanfare. Hawk hadn't advertised the reopening, hadn't made any announcements. He simply unlocked the doors at 6 a.m., turned the sign to open, and began prep work for the day ahead. By 6:30, every seat was filled. No one mentioned the fresh paint covering repaired walls, or the new windows still bearing manufacturer stickers. They ordered breakfast, drank coffee, exchanged town gossip as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Sheriff Denton sat at the counter, his morning routine resumed, but his eyes carrying a new vigilance. The corrupted deputies had been replaced with officers personally vetted by federal agencies. His daughter had transferred to our university closer to home. His wife's medical treatments continued without interruption, now covered by a special victims compensation fund. Bill Tennant occupied his usual seat by the window, newspaper spread before him. The Vietnam veteran moved more restively these days. The night's exertions had aggravated old injuries, but he carried himself with renewed purpose. The veterans who had stood together that night had formed a more formal group, meeting regularly to support each other and remain prepared for whatever might come next. Sally worked the floor with her customary efficiency, but customers noticed how she'd pause occasionally to glance at the door when it opened, assessing each new arrival before returning to her duties. Like everyone in Pine Creek, she'd learned that safety was not something to take for granted. FBI agent Reynolds entered at 8:17 a.m., now a familiar face in town. The investigation had expanded far beyond Pine Creek, following the threads of Diego's operation to trafficking networks in 3 states. Each day brought new arrests, new rescues, new evidence of how extensively the cartel had infiltrated seemingly untouchable communities. "Final paperwork," he announced, placing a folder on the counter. "Your official statement about the Diego Hernandez shooting has been accepted as self-defense in the line of duty. No further action required." Hawk nodded, continuing to work the grill without interruption. The women. Reynolds understood the question immediately. All in protective custody. 3 have already agreed to testify against the organization. The others are receiving treatment and immigration assistance. It was the news Hawk had been waiting for, confirmation that the mission's true objective had been accomplished. Not just the elimination of a threat to Pine Creek, but justice for those the cartel had victimized. "Your actions saved lives," Reynolds continued, accepting the coffee Sally poured without asking. "The intelligence we've gathered from the operation here has compromised cartel networks we've been trying to crack for years." "That what you're telling the Oversight Committee?" Hawk asked, with the hint of a smile. Reynolds chuckled. "The official report emphasizes interagency cooperation and community engagement rather than, say, armed veterans conducting paramilitary operations. Certain details have been streamlined. Politics and bureaucracy, the inevitable aftermath of any operation. Hawk had seen it in Afghanistan too, where messy realities were transformed into sanitized reports for civilian authorities. Some things never changed. "What about the town?" he asked, flipping pancakes with practiced precision. "Federal reconstruction grants approved yesterday. Disaster relief funds as well, under somewhat creative classification." Reynolds sipped his coffee appreciatively. "Your representative was surprisingly effective once the full scope of the trafficking operation was explained." The bell above the door chimed as Miguel Suarez entered with his wife. The grocery store owner still moved cautiously, scanning the room before fully entering. Another life permanently changed by the cartel's brief reign. He nodded respectfully to Hawk before taking a seat. "We're healing," Hawk observed, answering his own question. "Adapting." Throughout the day, more townspeople filtered through the diner. Some came for meals, others just for coffee and conversation. Many approached Hawk quietly, offering thanks that he acknowledged with simple nods. Words were unnecessary between people who had faced death together. By closing time, a new normal had begun to establish itself. Not the innocent small-town atmosphere that had existed before, that was gone forever, but something perhaps more valuable had replaced it. A community that understood its own strength. That had faced predators and survived. That now stood vigilant, aware that the world contained dangers requiring readiness. As Hawk wiped down the counter that evening, Sheriff Denton returned, taking a seat near the register. "Marco called," he said without preamble. "DEA informants report the cartel power structure is in chaos without Diego, internal fighting for control, rival organizations moving into their territory." Hawk absorbed this information thoughtfully. "They'll reorganize eventually. Someone will take Diego's place. But they'll remember what happened here," Denton replied. "The message has been sent. This town fights back." 6 months after the night, Pine Creek hosted its annual Founders' Day celebration. Streets that had once echoed with gunfire now overflowed with parade floats and laughing children. Businesses that had served as defensive positions during the battle were decorated with banners and streamers. The scars remained visible to those who knew where to look, but life had continued its inevitable forward momentum. In the diner's kitchen, Hawk prepared for the celebration's traditional community dinner. The rhythmic chopping of vegetables, the precisely timed rotation of items on the grill, the careful seasoning of each dish. These simple acts had become more than just cooking. They were affirmations of normalcy, of continuity. The last shot had changed subtly in the months since the confrontation. The new windows were now bulletproof, though few customers realized it. The redesigned layout offered better sightlines and fewer blind spots. The basement had been reinforced and stocked with emergency supplies. Preparations made not in fear, but in pragmatic acknowledgement that knowledge, once gained, couldn't be unlearned. Sally entered the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "They're ready whenever you are," Hawk nodded, making final adjustments to the massive pot of his now famous chili, a recipe perfected during long deployments where making the bland palatable had been a survival skill. Outside in the dining area, familiar faces gathered around pushed-together tables. Bill Tennant and his fellow veterans occupied the center, their informal militia now officially recognized as a community emergency response team, complete with training and certification. Sheriff Denton and his deputies, including two who had transferred from neighboring counties specifically to serve in Pine Creek after hearing what had happened there, Miguel Suarez and other business owners who had transformed from potential victims to active participants in the town's ongoing vigilance, and, seated among them, somewhat awkwardly but with genuine inclusion, Agent Reynolds and his FBI team. The federal presence in Pine Creek had diminished over time, but never fully withdrawn. The town had become something of a case study in community resilience against organized crime, a model being cautiously implemented in other vulnerable communities. Along trafficking routes, Hawk emerged from the kitchen carrying the massive pot of chili, setting it at the center of the gathering. The conversation paused, as all eyes turned to him expectantly. Public speaking had never been his strength, but some occasions demanded acknowledgement. 6 months ago, he began, his voice quiet but carrying. Our town faced something most communities never encounter. We learned hard truths about the world beyond our borders and about ourselves. Heads nodded around the tables. No one needed reminders of what they had endured together. What happened here wasn't unique. Towns like ours are targeted every day by those who see us as easy prey, who mistake small for weak, who equate peaceful with defenseless. He looked around at these people who had become more than neighbors, who had become comrades in the truest sense of the word. What was unique was our response. We faced predators together. We protected each other. We refused to be victims. Sheriff Denton raised his glass in silent acknowledgement, followed by the others. The gesture spread around the tables, not celebration of violence, but recognition of the unbreakable bonds forged in its crucible. The world out there hasn't changed, Hawk continued. There will always be those who prey on others. But we have changed, and that makes all the difference. As conversation resumed and the meal began, Hawk took his customary position where he could observe the entire diner. His vigilance hadn't diminished, but it now existed alongside something that had been missing since his return from Afghanistan. Purpose, community, peace that wasn't defined by the absence of conflict, but by the presence of something worth protecting. Behind the counter of a small-town diner, a Marine Scout sniper had found his final mission. Not ending lives, but preserving them. Not destroying, but building. Not merely surviving, but truly living. Sometimes the deadliest predators wear aprons instead of uniforms, and sometimes